Well, good evening and welcome to the latest in the IEA series of In Conversation events, where we sit down with a politician, thought leader or newsmaker to discuss their philosophy, their views and what they think of the world today. If you've missed any of the previous conversations with Sir Graham Brady MP, Linda Whetstone and Douglas Carswell, you can watch them all on the IEA's YouTube channel. Tonight's guest is Nicky Morgan, who's served for almost 10 years in the House of Commons as MP for Loughborough before stepping down in 2019. Shortly after, Nicky was elevated to the House of Lords, where she sits as the Rt Hon Baroness Morgan of Cotes. During her time in Parliament, she served in 3 different cabinet positions, first as Secretary of State for Education while also holding the Women and Equalities brief, then later as DCMS Secretary, as well as Economic Secretary and Financial Secretary to the Treasury and Chair of the Treasury Select Committee. I think we can all agree that's a particularly wide-ranging career, and I'll try to touch on a number of those areas during the next hour. But a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. We are hosting this event on 2 platforms, and thank you to those of you joining on both Zoom and YouTube. I'm afraid that we can only take questions during the Q&A from those joining us on the Zoom call, but please do feel free to engage on the YouTube chat. It's just that your comments will not get to me here as chair. If those on Zoom could submit questions through the Q&A function, I and the team will be able to see them, and I'll put as many as possible to Nicky during the evening. But please do upvote those you find particularly interesting. All of those in the audience on Zoom will remain on mute throughout the event in order to avoid any background noise or other distractions. Now, without further ado, I will set about asking the first question, and thank you to Baroness Morgan for joining this evening. Now, your most recent role in the Cabinet was as Secretary of State for DCMS, which is a very diverse brief. We at the IEA were delighted to hear you say in October last year that you were open to the idea of replacing the BBC licence fee with a subscription model, something that my colleague Professor Philip Booth has advocated in numerous IEA reports. There are also briefly rumours that you were in the running to be the next BBC chairman. How do you feel about the future of the BBC? The Conservative Party and public opinion seem fairly set against the licence fee. Do you think that reform is inevitable, and what other challenges do you think that the BBC faces?
Well, good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you all this evening, and thank you for that first question. Well, I think that the BBC, and I think in a way the last 10 months have demonstrated even more some of the challenges that the BBC faces, and particularly obviously from streaming services. The fact is that although many of us, millions at home more than we've ever been and desperately searching for good content to watch, I think probably inevitably a lot of that content is not found on the BBC these days. That doesn't mean the BBC don't make some great programmes, because they absolutely do. But the choice now is very much from the streaming services, and also, of course, from on demand. So I have a 13-year-old son who I don't think ever sits down and watches a programme at the time that it's shown on terrestrial TV. He just expects to be able to rock up and watch what he wants to watch when he wants to watch it. Now, iPlayer has responded obviously to that, and I know the BBC is part of working with BritBox as well. But I just think that more and more people are going to expect that choice, and I think therefore asking people to pay, a fee which basically goes to fund. A tiny proportion of the licence fee goes to other channels, but most of it goes to the BBC. And I think asking people to pay that in order to watch their TV or to use their TV or other device, but they're not going to watch the main channel that it funds, I do think is a model that's going to get harder and harder to defend as the 21st century continues. The fact is that, you're broadcasting night on YouTube. An awful lot of people now, that's exactly one of the channels they use when they are wanting to access great content. We're going to come on, I think, and talk about online harms, as well, and the responsibility of the social media companies. So we'll have to wait and see. Obviously, I launched the consultation as well to decriminalise the licence fee. And I do think it's hard again to defend the fact that people are asking people to pay a fee, and if for whatever reason that doesn't get paid, then actually you're potentially going to send people or give them a criminal conviction for non-payment of a broadcasting service. I think all of these things need to be looked at. I think the BBC realises the significant competition it's got. I do think it's raising its game and accepts that competition, but broadcasting is going to continue to evolve, I think, very quickly.
And you talked about the BBC sort of responding to competition. I mean, what do you see as the pathway to reform, and what shape or form might the BBC take at the end of it?
Well, I do think the BBC has got an extreme. I know that there are going to be people watching, and I know that I had many constituents who wrote to me and with great disagreements about BBC programmes, particularly around news coverage. But I don't think sometimes we, perhaps sitting here in Britain, realise just what a very strong reputation the BBC has around the world, and how for many people living in countries where they don't have such a free press, actually the BBC is a real beacon of hope. So, and I do think that whatever happens, if you are a BBC journalist and you stick your microphone in front of any world leader and say, I'm from the BBC, the chances are they feel that the world leader feels they should answer the questions from the BBC. But having said all of that, I think what probably will happen is that the BBC has to work out which sectors, which types of programming it really wants to be competitive in, where it has an absolute leading edge, and also recognising, I think that the subscription model, whether you end up with some basic services that everybody gets and some other channels that people choose to subscribe to, are things that the BBC board is going to have to consider in the not too distant future.
Mm. Now, as you mentioned earlier, we do want to talk a little bit about online harms. Obviously, that was another part of the DCMS role. And you recently tweeted that the online harms bill will be one of the most important that the UK Parliament considers this year. It looks as though the government will be including a definition of harm. What do you think that will look like, and what reassurance can you give to people like many at the IEA who are concerned about the impact on freedom of expression?
Yeah. Well, look, I do understand those concerns, and I would also say those concerns are very well understood, both at the heart of DCMS amongst those who are working on this policy, but also more broadly at the heart of government, including Downing Street. And the reason I said it's important is because I do think that the social media companies, and we'll perhaps talk about the Trump thing in a moment, the decision that Twitter made, but I think the social media companies are incredibly influential. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing in itself, but I do think that it's right that governments around the world ask questions about the influence of these companies. And I see them very much in a way, it's the same sorts of questions, can you regulate, that we had probably several decades ago for tobacco companies, but also for environmentally polluting companies, for example. And actually we started this session, I was talking about the BBC, for broadcasters. And if you accept that many people now will get their news, they'll get opinion pieces from social media companies, then it does seem that, to me, that they should be starting to be regulated in the same way that our broadcasters and our newspapers are, whilst absolutely enabling freedom of speech, freedom of expression, journalistic content. And they should be vigorous places for debate and for people to be able to put forward views. But I think inevitably there are lines, there is illegal content that I don't think anyone would want to see on platforms is widely available. And then you're right, there's this definition of, I'm not sure that there is going to be a definition of harm in there. I think people, one of the things that hasn't yet necessarily been clear, apart from those who are very already engaged in looking at the draft proposals, is this is about systems regulation, not about content regulation. And for all of us who say, well, I don't like this particular post and I think it should be removed, the point is going to be about looking at the terms and conditions, the systems that the social media companies have put in place to deal with complaints, to be transparent about the way that they allow accounts to continue or not. And then Ofcom, as the independent regulator, saying to the companies, well, you say you have these terms and conditions, are you actually following them? Are you being consistent in your approach? Asking the companies to produce their own transparency reports. It's not going to be easy. And again, I think some of the debates we're going to have in Parliament and therefore beyond are going to be some pretty fundamental, asking some pretty fundamental questions about rights, about freedom of expression, about how we want these companies to conduct themselves, about the role, the influence that they have. But I think it's right that Parliament should be having those debates, and that companies that have set themselves up shouldn't be the ones left to decide, who does or doesn't have a platform, but also about the algorithms, the content that is already curated, that means that people end up often existing very much in an own echo chamber.
Sure, but I mean, do you think that this system's approach will mitigate some of the possible unintended consequences? I mean, on kind of unintended consequences of this bill, I mean, for instance, does it risk running in direct opposition to what the government is trying to do through the CMA? Does it risk entrenching the large incumbent platforms' positions? I mean, often we see in response to the threat of more regulation that it's the big incumbents who are most supportive of it.
Well, I think we have to query. I mean, many of them will say we welcome regulation. Do they really? And I know there's concern about, many of these companies are now hiring an absolute army of people to deal with the regulations, to deal with governments around the world, to explain their views. And I think that is a good point about competition. What's really interesting is that many jurisdictions around the world, the UK to perhaps a certain extent with the CMA, but more Europe and the US, are actually choosing to trim the power of some of these social media companies through antitrust, through competition legislation, as much as regulation of conduct and content. Which the UK, obviously, with the online harms bill, that's another approach. Although, I do want to be really clear about this, that, Ofcom is not going to be looking at individual posts and entertaining people's appeals and saying, well, that should come down or that should stay. That's absolutely not the role of Ofcom. But you are, I think the sort of the risk of long-lasting consequences from the online harms bill, it is a very real risk, and that's why I think that officials and ministers, this has not been a rushed process, and will not be. We're not going to see a bill until 2022 in terms of a legislation being passed, until 2022 at the earliest. And I suspect it's going to take quite a lot of debate in Parliament and in the out in the public as well about the right way to regulate, and there'll be an awful lot of amendments put forward. And I think the government will, obviously, there'll be a lot of pressure to add to the online harms bill, to regulate further. And I think the government is going to, it's going to be a real balancing act to try to resist a lot of the calls to go further. However, I do think that the UK, given our legal system, given our attitude, our open economy, the fact that we do support the growth of the tech companies, the UK is the right place to be sort of testing out and to be legislating on this. And I hope that the tech companies will understand that and will engage in that way.
Well, I'm sure we could do a deep dive into the online harms bill for the next 45 minutes, but I am going to move the conversation on because, as I said at the start, you did have a very wide-ranging parliamentary career. Now, you spent 2 years as Secretary of State for Education, which, as I mentioned, you combined with being Minister for Women and Equalities. Straddling those two briefs would have been extremely challenging over the last year, with school children of all ages facing immense disruption and parental stress levels no doubt reaching new heights. Now, of course, in an emergency situation, mistakes are being made, or with the gift of hindsight, there are things that you would have done differently. But now we know more about COVID-19 and who and how it affects, how do we reassure parents and children going forward? And do you think that we prioritise opening schools over another sector of our beleaguered economy?
Well, and I think this just goes to show, and I really feel for, and I think that most people in the country have enormous sympathy for ministers who are trying to make judgments that require, the wisdom of Solomon, basically. education is fundamental. And I used to say, I love being education secretary because education is all about the future. And if we educate our young people right, then we build a very, a likely successful future for our country. And so I do think that the Prime Minister and Gavin Williamson were right to do everything they possibly could to keep the schools open. And I was incredibly relieved in November when, in the second national lockdown, schools were kept open. And I suspect that had we not had, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but had we not had this latest variant strain of the virus, I thought we would end up in another lockdown or near lockdown in the winter, just because it's the winter and because the vaccine programme had to be given time to take off. But I did think that we probably would not have to close the schools. But of course, the minute it became clear that in places where the virus had really taken hold and was spreading, that secondary pupils in particular were unwittingly, vectors in the transmission, as I think the Prime Minister has called them, that schools would have to shut. It's very difficult. I do think we should prioritise reopening our schools, and I think particularly primary. It's such a fundamental period of a young person's life to get those building blocks in place, that attitude to education, literally, obviously, reading and writing, but also social skills as well. And of course, we talk about unintended consequences of other things, but the unintended consequences of not having our schools open, both in terms of children for whom being at home is a miserable experience, where they're, not getting support, but also in terms of knock-on effect on productivity of parents who are trying to balance school and work as well. It's very difficult, though. I think members of Parliament are under massive pressure from people running businesses and sectors that have been badly affected. And it's devastating. If you are running a business, whether it's the culture secretary or an organisation rather, or in the hospitality sector, the travel sector, and you're watching, years of hard work of building your business up just disappearing through absolutely no fault of your own. And I know we're going to come on to talk about the public finances as well. It is just so very, very difficult. But I think education is fundamental to the long-term success of our country.
And what about, the widening educational attainment gap? We know that 7% of households, children don't have access to the internet. For some school children, homeschooling is just impossible. This simply cannot happen. Do you think that we're almost at a point where the educational attainment gap has widened so dramatically that it may not be narrowed in the course of some school children's lifetimes? And what can be done to mitigate that?
Well, I sincerely hope that's not the case in terms of the widening education gap being something that can't be dealt with. But it is a real problem, and it's also as a former education secretary, following Michael, handing on with Justine and then Damien, we had really begun to see massive progress in our education system. I am a firm believer in the academy model of education. I'd like it to have gone further and faster. And I know that people at the education front line will be they'll be very conscious, the teachers, of those pupils who would have been making progress had they been in school, and then as you say, through perhaps home circumstances, not getting the support needed, not being able to engage, needing to be in a classroom where they've got that face-to-face teaching, and not getting that, therefore they're slipping backwards. And I think what we really need, and it is difficult for a government when they are in the middle of dealing day to day with a crisis, to be able to plan ahead. But I really hope that somewhere in government, somewhere in the Department for Education, there is a small group of people who have been tasked with planning the recovery post-pandemic, an education recovery plan, because I do think that by using organisations like the Sutton Trust, and there'll be others as well, who have got real expertise in working with the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged in terms of education, those most at risk, those who are slipping behind, actually with real intensive support, it will be possible to help them to catch up. Of course, you'll need to work with parents, work with families, but I think most parents will want somebody to work with their children to assist them to make that catch up. so that hopefully by the start of the next academic year in September, we have really tried to help as many young people, catch up as we possibly can. I do think that's absolutely, it's possible, it's essential, but of course everyone's also exhausted. So we need to think about the pressure we're placing on the whole system as well.
Sure. And you touched on parental productivity there and the knock-on impacts of school children being at home. We're hearing a lot now about the burden, particularly on women over the course of the crisis. They're the ones who are potentially sacrificing their career to take on more of the caring responsibilities, not to mention how women have historically been impacted by recessions. Do you think that this has unequivocally been a bad crisis for women? Or do you think there are some silver linings around the normalization of remote and flexible working? Do you think there are any downsides to putting a narrative into the public domain about how much women are suffering in this crisis, about how it's going to widen inequality between the genders?
So I think there's always a danger of talking unremittingly about how negative something is, and you're absolutely right. I think for those, I spend a lot of time as women's minister talking to employers about the need to offer flexible working, how possible it was, but I think we shouldn't also forget other employees, for example, who have other issues with being asked to go every day to an office or for so many days a week and be in a working environment. I was reading a very interesting article the other day about employees with disabilities for who often again would ask if they could work from home or work remotely and were being told no, that's not possible. And of course, because of the pandemic, actually we've all had to find ways to do that, and tonight's event is a really good example of that. So I think you're right to say that there are those for whom they've been asking to work flexibly, asking to work from home, arguing they could be just as productive by doing so, and they've absolutely been able to prove that. I think it's going to be a balancing act for employers, because I suspect there will be many people who won't want to go back to working in an office, having to commute full time on the basis of what they were doing. I do think, though, we are innately social beings, and so many people will want to be working in office with others for at least a period of the week. And I'm also mindful, so I'm part of the House of Lords Life Beyond COVID committee, and I have to say Life Beyond COVID felt like a pretty remote possibility when we started. Thanks to the vaccines, I think we can now begin to see the end of this. And I'm really conscious of the fact that we took some evidence from people who wouldn't normally engage with House of Lords or any select committees over the summer. And there were some people who were saying, actually, and particularly women, this has given me an opportunity to be with my family in ways I would not normally have been or had that time. So, again, there are some people for whom actually this has provided opportunities. And I think men would say this as well, to be with families in ways they might not otherwise have been. But undoubtedly, there are those, and it does tend to be more women than not, who are finding the juggle between trying to carry on working in the way that they would like to, or that their employers expect, and also trying to supervise homeschooling, an almost impossible mix. Now, some employers will be brilliant about this. They will understand. Some, of course, will be less supportive. Some will have readily agreed to furlough. There is always, of course, the danger that some employers almost are too ready to agree. So they sort of start offering furlough to people on the basis of, you're going to have an issue, would you like to be furloughed? And I absolutely think it's got to be about the choice of the employee. They've got to be the ones who are, can I do this or not? But really interesting anecdotal evidence from, I was reading something from somebody who edited a journal inviting academic articles, and they'd noticed within a matter of weeks of the first lockdown that the number of articles being submitted by women had dramatically decreased. And so, I think, again, I talked about sort of recovery plan for education. I think just generally, there may well be people for whom actually the last year has meant it's proved impossible to work in the way or to make the contribution to work they would normally want to. And I think allowances, should be, so for example, research grants and funding are often handed out on the basis of academic articles published. Well, if that's not been possible, then there are going to have to be allowances made.
Sure. So thank you. I'm going to turn my attention now to the state of the public finances, which will be something that the UK is going to be grappling with in the aftermath of this crisis. Now, of course, she served in 2 ministerial roles within the Treasury, 2 years as chair of the Treasury Select Committee. I mean, first question is, how do you feel about the amount of government spending? Are you comfortable with it, given the unusual circumstances, unfortunate circumstances that we now find ourselves within, or could the Treasury or should the Treasury have exercised more restraint?
No, I mean, I as a Conservative, I don't enjoy looking at the state of the public finances and seeing what a massive amount of debt the country has taken on. I don't think this is the position that any Conservative government, certainly not the one elected in December 2019, would have expected itself to be in. But having said that, I think the spending has been absolutely necessary, and I think as Bank of England papers and others have shown, actually being able to bridge that gap, keeping people furloughed, given how reliant we are as a country on consumer spending, being able to keep businesses and other organisations going. So particularly my former sectors, culture and sport and those sorts of things, which are massive, both employers, but also in terms of income generators for the country, be able to get them going, has been an absolutely necessary step. And I, take my hat off really to those in the Treasury and elsewhere who have worked at speed on schemes. That doesn't mean there won't be issues. We know there'll be fraudulent claims, for example. We know that there are going to be loans that people are going to struggle to pay back. And will there be some businesses that would probably not have made it through anyway, but have done because of the support, but will still find life a real struggle to keep their business going afterwards? Yes, there will be. I do think we're going to have to look at this debt in a very different way. But as you say, I was in the Treasury when George Osborne was making difficult decisions about reining in public spending before, and well, the fact that we're able to borrow shows that we were able to get the public finances under some control. But there's going to be a huge task now, which, having been through the hard decisions in the past, we're going to face more very difficult decisions, I think.
Do you think that there will be a challenge in terms of the battle of ideas? I mean, the Conservatives have always prided themselves on being the party of fiscal responsibility, but the explosion in public spending since March 2020 has emboldened those on the left who think goods like broadband, shall we say, should be funded by the taxpayers. Has the Overton window just swung drastically to the left in terms of what is and isn't acceptable levels of public spending? And how can people like my colleagues and myself at the IEA, who believe in small government and fiscal responsibility, make the case for that in difficult times like these?
Well, I think you should make the case, and you should continue to make the case. And I think to remind this current Conservative government, and I think in both the Prime Minister and Rishi, you will find a receptive audience, because I don't think the current level of spending there hasn't been a fundamental change in the attitude of Conservative governments to public spending, to having fiscal rules and everything else. But I mean, I do think that actually one of the strengths of the Conservative Party is our ability to look at what needs to be done, decisions that need to be taken, and to take them. And I think that the public will recognise actually the levels of support, the fact that many people have been, kept in jobs. People have been able to, some people have been able to save, but actually people have been able to carry on spending because they have felt more secure in their jobs than they would ever otherwise have expected, given the cliff edge that the economy fell over in March of last year. But I think that as we come out of this crisis, I think that the voice of the IEA and others will be important in reminding the government, hang on a second, we might well have funded this because of the exceptional circumstances, but this isn't normal. Because what we found in 2010 coming into government was it's very difficult. Once you started giving people increased spending, more money, it's very difficult to take it away. So I think reminding people of why spending has happened in these extraordinary circumstances, but how this is not normally the way that we would do things, is going to be incredibly important. And I think will help in terms of the discipline of future budgets. But we are some way off having that normal discipline at the moment.
Sure. I mean, we saw just yesterday the vote on universal credit and the uproar at the notion that the uplift might be cancelled on the 31st of March. But I'm going to move on here to the subject of select committees. As mentioned, you were previously chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Now, these are an important cog in the parliamentary machine, but their work can really go under the radar. I think it would be quite helpful for our viewers to hear a bit about their role within Parliament, and perhaps why you think they are misunderstood and ultimately why they matter.
Well, I do think that they are one of the bits of our Parliament that work incredibly well. And certainly, you know, when I was chairing the Treasury Select Committee at a time when Parliament was pretty gummed up with Brexit, people falling out with each other, frankly, not leading the public debate and national debate in the way that you would normally expect from the House of Commons. Actually, it was the Select Committees who did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of continuing also to work on other issues. Because inevitably, you know, Parliament and government became incredibly Brexit focused, but that doesn't mean that other things aren't happening. So in a way, things like the issues we've just been discussing about the public finances, the new fiscal rules, you know, the role of committees, in that case, the Treasury Select Committee, but for example, the Health Select Committee, in terms of looking at the decisions made in the course of the last 10 months in dealing with the public health crisis. You know, do we have the right public health framework going forward? What lessons have we learned? What do we need to do in the future? You know, the role of local authorities in all of this, that's the, you know, the MHCLG committee. I think, and the thing about select committees is they can be incredibly nimble. And again, what we've seen is, I'm not sure that anybody relishes being summoned to give evidence to a select committee. You know, I used to say it was quite a useful thing. And I remember being reminded by a very senior bank chief executive who turned to his government affairs person and said, your sole KPI for the year is keeping me out of the clutches of the Treasury Select Committee. But of course, what we've seen with all the online meetings and everything else is that people can be beamed in from all over the world in order to give evidence to these committees. And actually, you can launch an inquiry pretty quickly, you can gather evidence quickly, and you can get your conclusions out. And then, of course, you can invite the minister to come and to explain why they will or they won't be doing the things that have been recommended. And so when people talk about having a sort of, you know, a big inquiry into COVID or a big inquiry into other things, then I think actually the select committees have a role in stepping in and saying, no, we can do a lot of this. It's cross-party. It works very well on a cross-party basis. I found it was one of the best places for people of very different political persuasions to actually, you know, find a way to work together to reflect those in the reports that we published. And so I really hope the select committees are going to have and I expect they will have a very important role in unraveling the last 10 months, but also looking to the future as well.
Sure. So how do you find being part of the House of Lords after almost 10 years in the Commons? The tone and the format of debate is very different, but also you no longer have constituents. You're not necessarily raising specific local issues, and you can take a broader approach to the issues that matter to you. Has that been an easy adjustment?
Well, I mean, I obviously went into the House of Lords as a Minister, as a Secretary of State, and there haven't been many of those. So, you know, I had sort of, there are some rules actually, interestingly, for Secretaries of State who sit in the House of Lords, so they were dusted down. But I wasn't there very long in that role, and I was only a backbench member of the House of Lords for a couple of weeks before the pandemic struck. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the House of Lords has adjusted incredibly well to remote working. We vote remotely. We are able, it's not quite the same, of course it's not, but we're able to participate in debates, in questions, in legislation, in select committees, all done remotely. And I think there's going to be a debate going forward about exactly which bits of that do we keep, which bits do we go back to before. But your point about lack of constituents is a really good one, because for me, I mean, I think the two things I've learned about the House of Lords, you know, one is undoubtedly as an MP, certainly when you arrive in the House of Commons, much of the work that you get involved in, the APPGs, the potentially select committee, potentially the questions and debates you're taking part in, it's very much shaped by your constituency. In fact, you know, in our maiden speeches in the Commons, you know, we are expected to talk about the constituency and about the things we want to achieve on behalf of constituents. So without that framework in the House of Lords, you are, as you suggest, much more free to think, well, what are the areas that really interest me? And you're encouraged as well to have outside interests. In fact, you know, really being in the House of Lords should not be your full-time thing. You are expected in a way to do other roles and responsibilities and bring experiences from those into the House of Lords. And the second big thing I've learned is the House of Lords is now where the heavy lifting of scrutiny of legislation happens. Based on those experiences, and the House of Lords ministers work incredibly hard to find a way through. Often, you have the big votes on legislation and the Commons ends, that's the ones that attract the headlines. But actually at the Lords end, what people are doing is burrowing away on legislation, tabling, detailed, thorny amendments. And then the ministers have to work really hard because the government doesn't have a majority in the House of Lords to unpick those, to work out how they're going to deal with it, to work out, what might go to a vote, what might not. Obviously, it helps now, obviously, from the government's perspective, have a majority in the Commons because you can overturn the Lords' amendments. But actually, so much of the detailed scrutiny, because the role of MPs has changed, I think the role of the House of Lords has changed now in really, really scrutinising our legislation to make it better, which there often just isn't time for in the Commons.
So I'm going to just move to some of the questions in the Q&A, and there are two here, one sort of looking back and one looking forward, which I'll ask you together. Baroness Morgan's political career is an impressive one. If I may ask, what were her biggest highlights and why? And what is the one thing she might do differently were she able to go back in time? And we have another anonymous attendee asking whether you would ever see yourself returning to a front bench role.
My highlights were, frankly, as many people, I was involved in the Conservative Party for, over 20 years before I was elected. So, just being elected and being part, I think, of the 2010 to 2015 Parliament was a real highlight. Making some important decisions. I think that first Parliament, even though we were in coalition with the Lib Dems, we did some really important work, both in terms of public finances, but I would point to things like education as well. And actually policies such as universal credit, which was often derided and attacked, but has absolutely proven its worth, I think, in the current crisis, that need to support people who are in work, but whose income, it's a much better way of supporting people who are working, who need income support, than the Labour Party's tax credits, for example, which has bound people up in red tape, and MPs spent ages trying to unpick with the DWP. Joined the cabinet, but the Treasury Select Committee was a real joy as well to chair, for the reasons I've set out about select committees, but also it's a fascinating area in terms of obviously Treasury, financial services, but you get a huge amount more freedom obviously chairing a select committee than you do being a minister. What would I do differently? Being Secretary of State for Education is undoubtedly a very tough position, because everybody thinks that they know about education, including the Secretary of State, of course. And you've got people who are absolutely passionate about it through the teachers, heads, unions, but also you've got parents, you've got pupils themselves, often very articulate when you go and speak to the schools. Everybody's been through education and schooling, so therefore they've got the view on it. So you've got incredibly passionate stakeholders. I published in March 2016 a white paper really trying to look at the Gove reforms, the bits that were left undone, the bits that needed to be tidied up, as it were. And my great regret is that, because of Brexit, because of the change of Prime Minister, I didn't get a chance to really examine some of those. Things like what we would do with pupil referral units, which are an incredibly important part of our education. Go back to where we talked about education being fundamental to young people's chances. For young people who become disengaged from education for whatever reason, having the right framework and places for them to be re-engaged and to be given their life chances, to help them to shape their life chances, is incredibly important. I'd love to have done more on that. So your second anonymous, I'd love to know who your anonymous questioner is about the front bench role. Well, I guess you never say never, but I'm doing lots of fascinating things at the moment, and looking at how the House of Lords works from the backbenches is a great privilege. So I have to say it's not a return that I'm planning, and I certainly wouldn't expect it to be happening in any future decade.
So let's just stay on the topic of education and how vital it is, particularly at the moment in the midst of this crisis. We talked about whether schools should be one of those sectors prioritised in terms of reopening when the great reawakening occurs. I wonder what you thought about this idea that we've seen. The suggestion has been made that we prioritise vaccinating teachers so that we get schools open throughout the UK. Now, the government has obviously set out its priority groups, but there are those suggesting teachers should leapfrog the queue, they themselves being on the front line, but also enabling schools to reopen. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think two things really. I think sometimes at the heart of all the coverage of the coronavirus and COVID, we sort of slightly lose, why the restrictions like lockdown are taking place. It's with a virus like this, and again, I'm not an epidemiologist, we can't stop everybody getting sick. But what the restrictions were designed to achieve, and I think this includes things like the prioritisation list for the vaccines, is to stop the NHS being completely overwhelmed and unable, and sadly we've already seen it happening in some places, being unable to provide urgent other care to patients needing cancer treatment or who've had heart attacks or strokes or diabetes and that sort of thing. And so I've been asked this question before about, and of course the police, I think today, Cressida Dick, the commander of the Metropolitan Police, is saying, well, police should be prioritised as well. And there are very, very good arguments for all sorts of different people. But it has to be about those who are going to get most sick and therefore end up not just being ill with the virus, but being hospitalised and potentially, sadly, dying. Now, if there are teachers who are in those priority groups, perhaps less likely because of age, but perhaps more likely because of being clinically extremely vulnerable, then absolutely, I'd want to see them, having the priority that's been attached to them. But I think otherwise, the priority lists, are fixed because of the risk of those people in those priority groups, really becoming so sick that they become, and then the numbers, as we've seen in some places, overwhelming the NHS. So I think we've got to work our way through that. I think the other issue, of course, is and this is perhaps not a surprise. When you hear a lot of calls for this, people are rightly talking about the teachers. But of course, it's not just the teachers who are on the front line, who obviously put themselves out there. And don't forget, of course, schools are still open in many cases. They are looking after the children of key workers and critical workers. But what we saw, and the reason that schools have been shut this time, of course, again, was that the pupils themselves, particularly secondary pupils, were transmitting the virus. And even if you vaccinated all the teachers, I think until people could be certain that others were being vaccinated, being protected, many people will still be reluctant to send their children to school, because every time they go to school, there's a risk they bring the virus back into the house and infect people at home, who then end up sick and being hospitalised. So I just think the heart of this, we've got to remember why we are going through all these restrictions, and it has to be about protecting the NHS and trying to keep it open, not just for COVID patients, but also for other very sick patients too.
Now, I'm going to go back to one of the first questions that I asked you during this webinar on the BBC. We have a question from one of our attendees that has received the most upvotes, so I feel I must ask it. What do you think of the suggestion that the BBC should be turned into a subscription-based organisation run on a mutual basis?
Well, I think all these things, and I'm sure that Richard Sharp, who's been appointed as the chair of the BBC, along with Tim Davey, who I have to say I worked with Tim a little bit when I was DCMS secretary. We co-chaired something called Creative Industries Council. I think he's extremely good news for the BBC. I think it's quite difficult sitting here tonight to sort of say, well, this is the model that should be looked at. But I do think all these models are going to have to be looked at. I just think that, and I really hope that the BBC will understand that and will be open to looking at different models. And when I asked the question originally, I said, potentially something like a subscription model where you have sort of a basic level of services that's open to everybody, including news, for example, or some news services. And then there might be other channels where people decide, actually, I want to subscribe to this, I want to pay more, and therefore I'm going to invest. And that money then, and we've seen this a little bit, and Tim Davie has been, he headed up BBC Studios before he took over his current role. And of course, BBC Studios has been enormously successful in selling some of the BBC programmes around the world, generating quite a significant income, which is then obviously reinvested back into programming and everything else. So I think they've got the makings of a model there. And I trust that. I don't know. I think I quizzed Richard Sharp when I was on the Treasury Select Committee. He was part of one of the Bank of England committees. I'm pretty sure he's a man who's going to say, well, hang on a second, let's just think about all of this, given where we are, given where broadcasting is in the 21st century.
I apologise that I'm darting about the place with the questions, but just trying to go through the Q&A function here. One question that caught my eye is, of course, we were talking about the public finances earlier. As part of the younger generation, how worried should I be about later having to pay for the economic costs of COVID? How bleak does our future look? And of course, there was a Prince's Trust report out today talking about depression and anxiety rates among young people and how this has become a crisis in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, how worried should you be? Look, I think at the end of the day, sadly, the way our system is set up, it's often future generations that pay for the consumption of current generations. It's just that there's been obviously this massive spike in public spending, as I said before, I think for extremely understandable reasons, and I think it's been the right thing to do ultimately, because also for the next generation, if we're going to hand over to you a growing economy, then actually making sure that the economy had the support now, so that when we are able, and we saw this a little bit in the summer, actually once people were able to get out and spend, those in a position to do so, that is what they did, and that is good in all sorts of ways for job retention and job creation. But I would like to see, I mentioned about having a sort of education recovery plan. I hope that the government, and I think with things like the Kickstart scheme, but there'll be other schemes as well, is able to really demonstrate, here are the actions we are taking to invest in the next generation. Because I do think young people have paid a high price in order to safeguard the health of those most likely to get sick through the virus, often the older generation. I think the way a healthy society works, that is what we do. We look after each other. We look after younger generation, older generation. But I think in terms of helping schools to get back on track, pupils to get back on track, helping university students to get back on track. I feel for those for whom this is their first experience this year of university, arrived and found that actually, obviously, you couldn't enjoy life as a fresher in the way that you would normally expect to. This term, they're actually staying at home and doing all their learning online before they're going to be allowed back on campus. This is not what we want to see. And so I think a recovery plan. Interestingly, John Bird, who obviously set up the big issue, is working on something called the Future Generations Bill, and that's something that the Welsh government, have got a mechanism in place. I'm not sure that's the only way to do it, but I think something that this Conservative government can do that signals we are really going to invest in the next generation is going to be tremendously important in helping people to think, actually, yes, I do matter, and people are thinking about my future.
And I just wanted to touch on something you mentioned there about the Kickstart scheme. Do you believe that job creation schemes is the best way of boosting employment among young people over, say, deregulating and looking at employment law, looking at occupational licensing, and ultimately making it easier for people to enter the jobs market and for companies to take on workers?
Well, I think what you set out the second half, of course, that is a more sustainable way. And I think one of the things that we did in the 2010 Parliament was about the national insurance holiday for people, particularly if they take on, because for many, most people in this country, believe it or not, are obviously employed in smaller businesses, smaller enterprises. And actually for those smaller enterprises, taking on your first or your next employee, it's a big ask to be responsible for somebody else's bills, their mortgage, being able to look after their family, everything else. Actually having things like a national insurance holiday or a national insurance incentive scheme absolutely does help to create those jobs, and I think you're right, in a more sustainable way. However, having said that, I think given the circumstance we're in, having the creation of a scheme to get people, to get particularly young people, often those furthest removed from the labour market, to give them that experience, because I think what young people will often say is that they can't even get onto that first ladder, and because they haven't got experience, therefore they're not as attractive to employers, and therefore it's a bit of a vicious circle. So I think that some of the schemes are necessary, but I also think that the whole national apprenticeship scheme, and sadly I hear of employers who are letting their apprentices go because of the current situation. They can't fulfil the terms of the apprenticeship. Again, perhaps some more flexibility around that. Larger companies, perhaps less hit by the pandemic, being able to help and work with those in their supply chains, for example. All of that, as much creativity in these schemes as possible, and hopefully Treasury and Ministry, ministers saying we're open to as much creativity and innovation in these schemes as possible.
Now, one question we've had on the Q&A is around House of Lords reform. Would you support that? And if so, what would you change?
Well, so every Sunday we have a wonderful email that comes out from the Lord Speaker, Norman Fowler, and he doesn't hold back on what he thinks. And I think one of the things that obviously gets talked about a lot is that the House of Lords is extremely large. And it does make me uncomfortable that we have an unelected chamber that is bigger than the elected House of Commons. Now, there are mechanisms for peers to I'd take a leave of absence if they're doing a role that perhaps is less compatible with being in the House of Lords, or to retire. And whether there should be more encouragement towards retirement. I mean, there's talk about having an elected second chamber. I think those are all ideas that to be looked at. I'm slightly reluctant. I say, having been there and seen the sort of heavy lifting that many peers do in terms of scrutinising legislation, I think if we were to have people who were elected, unless they were elected for sort of much longer terms and could be elected once only, you end up with potentially with a sort of situation like the US, where you basically just done one election and you're kind of almost automatically on the election trail again. And I think actually that would, having seen it work in practice, that would not be great for our legislative processes, where we do need the House of Lords to be working. But I think there are other things about, either slimming it down or asking people to commit to certain time if they're going to be in the House of Lords. Those are the sorts of things that might make it work better.
Now, you were and still are a senior representative of the One Nation wing of the Conservative Party. Writing for Conservative Home in 2019, you said, One Nation conservatism is about what we want for our country, how we will tackle the challenges before us, and how we would achieve positive change. I mean, what would you say is the One Nation response to the challenges created by this pandemic?
Well, I think, and look, I think the One Nation wing, I mean, I think many Conservatives would identify. They might not call themselves One Nation Conservatives, but I think ultimately, all of my colleagues, Conservative colleagues in the House of Lords, but those in the former colleagues in the House of Commons, want the best for people. I think what the pandemic has demonstrated are some of the fundamental inequalities. And I think that's given us an opportunity. So we talked before about education, for example, and about lack of access to whether it's broadband or computing or supportive environment in which to be able to learn from home. I think that's a sort of issue that the Conservative Party is able to tackle, both from a sort of a galvanising, how can we help there to be a better supply of digital technology and broadband. And I think the response we have in relation to better broadband, by the way, is much better, than I think, Corbyn wanted there to be sort of free broadband and to be massively subsidised by the state. I think that's completely the wrong response. It's got to be the incentives given to private companies in order to make sure that we are better connected as a country. That's a much more sustainable way of doing it. So, Conservative response to inequalities in education, but equally also recognising, not shying away from the fact that there are these inequalities and there are young people who have had almost no education the past year. And so actually, being able to work with schools, charities, others in saying we are going to have a national education recovery plan, an opportunity for young people to catch up, and we're going to be. This is what we expect. We expect and want young people to be able to do this, because ultimately it's going to benefit them.
Now, given what we're seeing in the US, and this is a question from Tarquin Follis, and suggestions in polls that the young are becoming disillusioned with democracy, does Baroness Morgan see the Western liberal democratic model under the most significant threat since World War II? And what needs to be done?
I think when things are under threat, I mean, look, I think, in relation to the states, those who are talking about the rise of populism and the rise of Trumpism, have very firmly been put back in their box by the events of the last week or so. And we'll have to obviously see what happens, with President Biden and how the administration there turns out. I think, though, what people get very frustrated with, and the reason people turn to those who promise them responses and an easy answer, everything else, is a sense of frustration that problems that are staring us in the face, and we've known for an awful long time, remain unresolved and unaddressed. Now, I think there's a good reason, just because of the pandemic for the last 10 months, but we know, for example, that social care is an issue in this country that we desperately need to tackle. And yet it's been in the too difficult box for such a long time. And so that when people finally get there, either they have parents or family members need social care, they need it themselves, they realise this is a system that has not had the attention it needs for an awful long time. And so if somebody comes along and says, well, I'm going to solve this very easily, we're going to do this, this and this scheme, of course, it's much more complicated than that. So whilst I think that undoubtedly liberal democracy is under some pressure, that's what happens in electoral cycles and everything else. I think it's a system that will bounce back.
And another question in the Q&A. This is from Victoria Houston, who is our head of regulatory affairs at the IEA. Surely the effect of Ofcom regulating online harms will be to take action if they consider that a platform is not duly taking down content that Ofcom considers to be harmful. What safeguards should there be to ensure that platforms do not overzealously filter controversial, even offensive, but lawful content in order to mitigate their risks of fines and regulatory sanctions?
Well, I think that the point is that it's not for Ofcom to decide whether something is harmful. Actually, it's for the social media companies to set their limits, which they do arbitrarily anyway. They're just not very transparent at the moment. And so ultimately, it was the Twitter board that made the decision, for example, to remove President Trump's account without any reference to any laws or regulations. If Twitter had made it clear, they have those sort of very clear terms and conditions that said anybody who incites violence basically is going to find that we either suspend or remove their account. And then, they didn't do that. That's where the online harms bill comes in and says, Ofcom say, well, hang on a second, you say you're going to do this, but you haven't done it in this case, or you haven't been consistent. You've allowed this person to continue, but that person not to. Why are you not being consistent in the terms and conditions that you say that you are going to be following? So actually, in terms of, I don't think it's going to be possible. I mean, I think there's going to be able to be defined illegal content. We know what that is. Terrorism, child sexual exploitation, are two obviously very good examples, and the Home Office will talk about those. But it's going to be very much more about the social media companies being clear about what their own lines are, and being transparent about the way that they are making decisions. The white paper also does talk about potentially having sort of almost like class actions entertained, as well. But I think that transparency is going to be a real step forward in terms of social media companies explaining to the rest of us exactly how they are operating. Oh.
At the start of March, the Chancellor will be delivering his budget, and there have been rumours, reports in the past few days that he's eyeing up tax rises to foot the COVID bill. What one measure would you most like to see in the pending budget?
Well, I have to say, I think it's. Again, we'll have to see obviously how the virus and the vaccinations and everything else proceed in the next few weeks. My personal instinct is that March will be too early to think about tax rises, and that actually getting the economy back functioning again, getting sectors opening and growing, getting people to feel secure in their jobs again. All of that is going to be needed before tax rises, I think, can be properly thought through, because the Treasury will need to understand what is the potential long-term scarring effect, if there is one, and what is happening to unemployment, I think, before they can make those decisions. So I suppose I would be looking for measures that support that economic recovery. We talked about one, for example, whether there are incentives that can be offered to employers in order to either keep people in work or to expand their workforce. If you remember, there was going to be, as part of the job retention, there was going to be a bonus. If you had brought back employees from furlough and had then kept them in their jobs for a number of months, employers are going to be rewarded or incentivized to do that. That's the sort of scheme that I would like to see, because I think, as I say, we are very dependent in this country on consumer spending. You know, when I was chairing Treasury Select Committee, we did some work actually on household finances. You know, we don't have a high savings ratio in this country. It's got higher because of the pandemic, but of course that's not the right, you know, not in every household, in every income decile. But I think building up that security of employment is going to be incredibly important, and giving confidence to employers that they will be able to keep the people they've got and hopefully to expand their workforce.
Well, thank you to everybody who watched this evening, and thank you to Nicky. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Thank you to our IEA donors whose generous support helps keep us and our event program running, especially in a year of turbulence like this one. We've got putting up lots of content on the IEA's YouTube channel every week. I would urge those of you listening who have particular interest in the online harms bill to watch our recent video, which will be put in the YouTube chat function and Zoom chat, with Victoria Hewson talking about the online harms bill in a little bit more detail. And our In Conversation series continues apace. Next week, our Director General, Martin Littlewood, will be sitting down with the Leader of the House of Commons, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and in a fortnight's time, we'll be hosting former Brexit Secretary David Davis. Looking a bit further ahead, in early March, we're delighted that we'll be joined by the new Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Kwasi Kwarteng. And as I say, all episodes will be available on our YouTube. They'll be live streamed and they can be found on the events page of the IEA's website. As for Live with Littlewood, our weekly broadcast featuring a rotating panel of guests, that will be back from after the Christmas break tomorrow evening. So please do join us at 6 p.m. from 6 p.m. for the usual mix of economic analysis and expert views on the week's headlines. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.